welcome to the 10th edition of our newsletter, edition number 9, because we started counting at 0 because we're like that. So what we wanted to talk about today is a little bit different from the way that we've done some of these expert Q&As in the past. We wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've learned over the last 10 weeks or so. We've spent a bunch of time doing these expert Q&As. We've also been talking to probably north of 50 different revenue and operations leaders, and we're starting to hear some common themes. And so one of the biggest, most common themes, of course, is the pandemic and the next normal. And so what I wanted to do is really kind of drill into that today and talk about some of the different components that we're hearing as people talk about how things have changed for sales and probably will stay changed, right? So one of the core things that we're hearing, which is something we've been talking about for a long time, and I think one of the things you'll hear with all this is the pandemic is just accelerating trends that were already well established. But all sales is inside sales right now. That is literally true. Been harping on that for a while. You don't have field sales organizations. You don't go out and talk to customers directly for the most part. And that has some fundamental differences or changes that organizations are undergoing right now. The other thing that you don't have is you don't have people co-located. Obviously, remote work has been a thing that has been growing generally, but sales organizations had tended, I think, up until recently, to try to co-locate as much as possible. It gives you a lot of energy and a lot of ability to kind of keep tabs on how things are going, and that's all kind of gone now with the pandemic. So I think the 3 things we want to talk about today are, we want to talk about motivating and structuring that distributed team, some of the things that are happening now as a result of all sales being inside sales, and then as a function of the fact that everything's inside now, you got to think about how do you ultimately reach your customers. And I think that accelerates two trends. One is product-led growth. One of the ways that you can reach your customers is by reducing friction in your product experience. And then the third piece, which Jen will talk about a ton, is content marketing. And that's been obviously a huge way that you drive demand for quite a while now, but it becomes just one of the few touch points you have with prospects and customers. So those are the 3 things we want to talk a little bit about. And so it'll just kind of be free-flowing conversation about what we've learned. So let's talk about dealing with these newly distributed teams where everything is inside sales. So first of all, Jen, I know you've had some conversations about motivating these teams, and also your academic background is about making sure that people are communicating, when they're not in the same place. So let's talk a little bit about what we've heard there.
Yeah, one of the big things that has been coming up over and over again is, early on in the pandemic, it was kind of thought it might be temporary, short term, whether we believed that rationally or hoped for it emotionally. And so it was kind of like, okay, great, Zoom happy hours and everything's going to be fine. We'll just be on Zoom more, right? And we all know that is, I don't know how many Zoom happy hours people are even doing anymore because we're tired of that. So one of the themes that keeps coming out is, so how actually do you stay engaged with your teams? How do you motivate, inspire, communicate, support, and engagement and all of that? And so we've been talking a lot. I hear people talking about using video a lot because video does convey more emotion and more signals than just a phone call.
We could be doing this in a podcast, but look, you get to see us.
I know.
Unless you're listening to it on iTunes and a podcast, in which case you can't see us.
Also, like and subscribe if you're listening to this.
Smash that like button.
But, on the other hand, video is kind of exhausting. I wonder if we're not turning a corner on video. I'm sorry. Rounding the corner. Because for a little bit, video was totally exhausting. Nobody wanted to do it after, 6 months of all Zoom. But now we're in this stage where it's clear this isn't this isn't ending soon. You used the phrase "the next normal" at the beginning of this. This isn't like we're going back to something else. Everything is changing, and so I think there has been a slow acceptance of, there was the initial Zoom video enthusiasm, and then the like, oh, this is too much. I'm so tired of being on video. We're going back into this kind of normal of, okay, we're going to do it. It doesn't matter as much if I don't feel like being on video. It's just sort of the natural way that we talk. So that's been a really interesting theme, that is just the way people talk about just literally the channels they use to talk to their teams, and how that's evolved over the past, 7.5 months? Yeah, 230 days, I think.
I definitely have heard in a lot of my conversations that kind of fatigue element, especially because, when you're in person, you're walking around, you're moving around, you have a little bit of a pause to change rooms between meetings and stuff. And certainly for revenue leaders that I've been talking to, when they're just in back-to-back Zooms, it's just it's a marathon. But I do think that the other thing that we're hearing, which is going to be a theme throughout this conversation, is that this is not, we're not going to go back to the way it was. So we just have to figure out the right way to do this, and what the right level of this kind of engagement is.
Right. So. You can't expect somebody to be in Zoom 8 hours a day, but they're going to have to do it some. So like, what's that balance, and how do we make sure we're incorporating video, because it is so much richer than phone, not as rich as in person, but and so how can we make that work? So settling into that, what actually works, is really important. Another thing that's been interesting the past couple months, more recently, is talking about what does a virtual sales kickoff look like? Because I think for a little bit, everybody hoped that by the time sales kickoffs roll around, at least for people that are on, a December or January fiscal year end, that maybe by January, February next year, we would be back to working in an office. But it's clear that that's not going to happen for most companies. So how do you recapture the energy that you get at an in-person sales kickoff? How do you translate that to a Zoom setting? And especially when everybody is sick of being on Zoom, what do you do? How does that change your schedule? How does that change the speakers that you're bringing in, the topics that you're covering? Instead of 2 days jam-packed sessions, do you spread it out mornings for 5 days?
And what are you learning about that? Like, what are you hearing?
It's interesting. I do think a lot more people are going to shorter sessions, so mornings over 5 days versus all day Monday and Tuesday. You might have 3-hour sessions throughout the week. Or thinking about, one of the things is bringing in motivational speakers. They might be different than the ones that you pick for an in-person event. So somebody who can actually engage with you over Zoom to help convey that. So someone who is experienced at podcasting or video broadcasting. So people are thinking differently about who those speakers are.
Right.
And the funniest one is just what swag people are thinking about. So coming from the marketing side, swag is always one of the things we spend the most time talking about. No, that's not totally true when it comes to sales kickoff, but thinking about different things and then preparing to send them to people's houses instead of shipping them all to the site. And so there's a lot of logistics involved. And I think the other thing that's interesting is whether teams are trying to organize this in-house, because it's a different set of skills than doing an in-person event. Or we've seen a lot more agencies and consultants who work specifically with this kind of thing, helping people throw a successful virtual event. So all of that's been pretty fascinating. And the stories of, events people have been to recently and what worked and what hasn't worked and all of that. There's a lot there as people really try to make, Q1 kickoffs what they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
So.
And I've heard that, just the challenge of these types of internal events generally, and we're, I guess, getting a little far afield from just, revenue organizations, but I think it's the revenue organization is a microcosm of many of the other things that we just took for granted of getting everybody in person. I was talking to someone the other day who, they have an annual meeting with a whole bunch of different stakeholders, and it became a 6-week production with all of these challenges they just never faced before, because you couldn't just do what you did previously. It was just go get 100 people in a room and have the conversation, right? And just so it was I guess probably the biggest piece of advice there, I would say, is typically you start planning for these sales kickoffs pretty early anyway, but just expect that if you're trying to do a sales kickoff in early January, that you really got to be thinking about all the logistics right now.
Yeah, and the other practical piece of advice I've heard is test everything, and then have backup plans for technology when it's gonna fail, if people can't get in. There's just something is going to go wrong. Something
Right.
always goes wrong at every sales kickoff, but different things will go wrong when they're virtual. And so testing stuff beforehand, having a plan, and then communicating everything 100 different ways to everybody before it starts so they know what to do when something does go wrong has all been, it's a different way of thinking about it. Just like with all of this, you are over communicating, right? Or what feels like over communicating. It's not, but it's just being sure that in this way of being, that we're all on the same page about stuff, which is just a little harder when you're not in the same room.
Yeah. So let's, I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and talk about kind of what we're hearing about team organization and those kinds of things, because that's changed. I think that's changing quite a bit. And so I think one of the biggest drivers of revenue team organizational changes in this world right now is there's no field. There's no field sales. There's no events that you're holding out in the field, and so everything looks a lot more like completely inside sales. So, what that's led to, I think, and I've heard this from a number of revenue leaders at this point, is really starting to rethink, to some degree, the fundamental structure and organizational structure of their team, and asking questions like, well, we have geographic territories because we have certain people we'd like to be able to go out in the field and visit this or that customer, or we have certain groups that maybe we want to go, like I was talking to somebody the other day who was, one of their demand gen tactics, they sold to developers primarily, and one of their tactics was to go to like local developer meetups and, buy a round of drinks at the bar and that kind of thing. And that just, that doesn't exist anymore.
Anybody
right?
can go to those meetups now, right? I haven't seen any of those kind of meetups that have been restricted to only people who are actually in a certain geography now. If it's online, anybody can go.
Right. And so either that or, it's just, it's less effective in many cases, right? If, you're the one who's kind of sponsoring the event and a whole bunch of people come out to the event, that's good. It gives you a chance to mill around and talk to people, and and then obviously there's trade shows and that kind of thing, and that's just not a practical way of reaching people right now. Now obviously you can have virtual trade shows and stuff like that, but that just it's just not quite the same, right? And so I don't know what the next normal for, I don't even pretend to know what the next normal for trade shows and things like that is, but right now we're that whole field aspect of having people in a particular geographic market is kind of irrelevant at the moment. And so what that's forcing people to do is reevaluate how they structure their teams to tackle that. And I think it's a healthy reevaluation because I talk to so many SaaS leaders who are, they're offering a SaaS product that's completely delivered over the internet, that is typically a SaaS product will have a pretty big TAM, and so there's a whole lot of different kinds of companies in a bunch of different industries that they could serve. And so as I talk to operations folks, they still are kind of clinging to this idea of like, well, we're going to break up these territories geographically and do that. But the reality is that there's really nothing different about your buyer in Northern California versus your buyer in New York or your buyer in Texas or whatever. And but what is different is the concentration of potential buyers in those locations, right? And so it actually, instead of becoming a nice way of kind of distributing out your effort, it becomes actually a real drag on how you ensure that reps have the same level of quality or the same size market that they're dealing with. And so I think that's leading to some ideas around, do we take territories and think about territories as much more verticalized kind of segmentation. Maybe there's particular industry knowledge that you need to have, and that's a way of thinking about segmenting. And then, I think one of the more interesting topics is maybe territories as we think about them don't really make sense anymore. Maybe what makes sense for the future is really just thinking about how do you take all of your inbounds or all of your addressable market and spread out the value or potential value evenly across your teams and across your reps, right? And so that leads to things like thinking about how do you segment on a potential value metric. It could be some kind of usage metric that you can be aware of already because it's public. It could simply be a revenue number. It could be company size. It all kind of depends on what it is you're offering, and then try to make sure that you're balancing the books of all of your reps based on that metric and not based on some kind of geographic segmentation or even an industry segmentation. And that leads to lots of challenges for managing assignments and making sure that reps have all the right books, and scoring accounts and all of those kinds of things. So lots of interesting challenges there. But I think this is a really healthy rethinking of this kind of just legacy tie back into geography, which is really not how most B2B, large TAM kind of organizations work these days.
Yeah, aside from some minimal time zone restrictions, right. It doesn't matter as much.
Yeah, I mean, I think it matters. Yeah, so I'm not saying get rid of your US and EMEA and APAC and that kind of thing. You really do have some constraints there, but if you're addressing North America, I mean, why bother trying to segment by zip code unless you really are trying to, unless there's some level of equality in terms of the number of accounts, or if there's still some way that you are physically dealing with a particular location. But that's becoming less and less relevant unless you're, still knocking on the doors of individual, local stores or something like that.
I think it's interesting. One of the things, and I haven't heard anybody specifically articulate it until you start talking about it right now, it makes me think that a lot of this is questioning a lot of our kind of basic assumptions about how we've been doing work. Because maybe the old ways don't make as much sense anymore. And that's a really good example of one of those. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think all of this, again, we're questioning the old ways, but we're also just accelerating some things that were already in place, right? I think it's pretty clear that we were doing less field sales now. We're doing less geographic segmentation, even 7 months ago than we were previously, because obviously you don't have to be physically co-located with a customer, but I think there's a theme that you hear from a lot of people that this is sort of accelerated stuff 5 years in a few months, right? And I think this is an example of that. And so
it's certainly aging us all 5 years in a few months.
We're hanging in there. So I think but another basic assumption that I think people are questioning is ultimately, how do you engage with prospects and your in this world where you have more limited touch points, right? And so you're seeing plenty of redoubling the efforts that you would normally have of just hitting the phones, doing a lot of outbound, really focusing in on those type of SDR activities. One just side theme that we might want to address at some point later is there's been a lot of questioning of the value of these kind of outbound SDR teams, these very large outbound SDR teams, and whether or not that's effective. It tends to be the least efficient part of any revenue organization, and if you have the budget, then great, because it can be fairly predictable. It's just a numbers game, right? But we're definitely seeing a lot of organizations that are starting to say, well, we're spending a tremendous amount on this part of the team. We're getting good value or more efficiency elsewhere from inbound demand generation that's coming through content, or we're getting good value from folks that are starting to use our product. But this kind of, let's go just call. It works, but it's got to be utilized alongside these other tactics. I think there was a sense, maybe a few years ago that was like that could be the driver, and in many cases that can't be. But that's probably the future of SDRs is a bigger conversation. They're still obviously a huge component, but what people are starting to do is say, all right, well, that is one way that we are, generating pipeline, right? So the other ways we're generating pipeline are product and content. So, let's talk about PLG for a minute, product-led growth. That's been a big topic across lots and lots of my conversation. So first of all, it's a hot thing right now. There's lots of good examples of product-led growth where companies have done well. And so you've got success stories like Slack and, Atlassian and Zendesk and, even DocuSign and then lots and lots of others that are a little bit more, even more consumer focused than those. But it's starting to lead to a lot of organizations doing what you would expect, which is saying, well, we're product-led growth, right? When its reality is maybe you've introduced like a free trial or something like that, when it's not really this mechanism that's really going to do significant acquisition for you. It's not a fully streamlined, like people can just buy more. You still have very much of this like injected sales friction. But one of the things that I think we're hearing a lot with PLG as companies are really trying to understand what to do is they're starting to think of their products and the experience around their products as another form of demand generation, right? And so at least for PLG that's focused on acquisition, there is some serious thinking that's going into that. And one of the more interesting trends that I see as it relates to revenue organizations is looking at your product as a channel means that you then get the ability to start thinking about your investment allocations, right? And so we have our marketing channels, which we're familiar with investing in. We're familiar with talking about the efficiency and what our unit economics are. On the sales side, with your SDRs and your outbound team, you have you've got a sense of that same type of conversation. Those budgets still end up being fairly separate, but now you've got this sort of third piece where you want to say, well, I've got a marginal $1 million to go spend on acquisition. Do I spend that on this paid marketing channel or this content channel or hiring more reps, or do I spend it on changes to how my products functions? And I think that's that conversation I think is pretty fascinating, because suddenly you have this kind of fungibility of that budget that you've got to really think about, and you have the opportunity to think about, whereas previously, nobody ever thought about like the sales head count versus the product and R&D investments as even being related to each other, by and large.
It's interesting the implications of that and what it means for product as part of the revenue organization, because you can't have a good PLG without some upsell in the product somewhere, right? And so to make that a consistent and excellent customer experience that ties in with everything else, that needs to be very closely tied to what's happening in sales and marketing and customer success, even though product is driving it. And so that's a really interesting balance that I think some companies are doing pretty well with, but a lot of us have a lot to learn on that. I just think about, when we talk about some of the products we use that do take a PLG kind of approach, if you're in a trial or a low cost tier or something, you're getting calls from salespeople saying, hey, I'm your account manager, let's talk about upgrading. The product is also hounding you to upgrade every time you click on a feature you don't actually have. And then you get pop-ups on the website. And so I think it's very important, and we've heard these concerns reflected a lot. I don't think anybody's really figured all of this out yet, but of balancing all those things so you're not irritating your customer because you're hounding them from 100 directions. So just the thoughtfulness that I think some people are putting into balancing all of those and making sure product and sales and marketing and customer success and everybody is represented as they think through this as in one entire experience is really, that's cool. And I think there's a lot of work we can do on that.
I mean, I do think you really have to start in this PLG world. You have to think about that more unified customer experience, because I mean the whole premise behind product-led growth, right, is that it's led by product. It's not necessarily led by sales, and so you might develop sales, or customer support kind of relationships with your customers, but the reason that we all think it's interesting is because it should mean that you have to invest in fewer humans to help the humans use and acquire your product, right? And so that means that that overall customer experience with your company, everything from the product experience to the support experience to the content and experience, all of those things have to make sense and work, because you're going to have you're inherently going to have fewer opportunities to have sales rep X is really good buddies with this customer because they've been on the phone for the last 3 years off and on, and so it's not that we're moving to no relationships or purely transactional kind of relationships, but in many cases PLG does lend itself to that, right? So you have to make sure that the automated part of your experience is good, in addition to those interpersonal interactions. So I think that and that just goes again to thinking about how you organize your company, how you organize your budgets, because those, you have the same kind of questions around allocating resources to support channels that you have to sales channels now. And so in some ways we're kind of bringing that conversation that's been ongoing in the service and support world to the sales organization in a way that maybe it wasn't previously. Long story short there, I think that we're really, what we're really saying is that the alignment that you have to have across all the different components from marketing all the way to service and support in your revenue organization is just getting stronger and stronger. In order to be effective, you've really got to make that work.
Mm-hmm. And now we're talking about also making sure product is involved in that. And
yeah. And so that leads to, I think, increased involvement in product marketing. Product marketing sits as that nexus point for all of those different organizations to communicate. I think that's super important, and it also speaks to something that's a little bit of another theme that we've heard a lot, which is, and again, this is just an acceleration of something that's already been going, but really thinking about revenue operations and what revenue operations means across all of those functions: marketing ops, sales ops, customer ops, and even then, a little kind of touching on product and how that ultimately drives things. And so that's just another example, I think, of trying to create that sort of operational substrate that everything else sits on top of, in order to connect all these pieces together in a way that maybe they previously didn't have to be as tightly connected. All accelerated by the fact that we're all sitting at home right now trying to figure all this out. So the last piece of this and the last kind of touch point that we want to talk about, and I think has been a really relevant conversation in a lot of cases, is the other way that you communicate with your customers is through your content and the messaging and everything that you put out. And so I know, Jen, you've been talking to a lot of folks about this. So what are you seeing? What are the changes that are happening with content as it relates to this next normal?
Yeah, the first one is, or kind of the foundation for all of this, is something we've already touched on, because we're not doing a lot of field marketing right now, or the field is moved online. Mm-hmm. That we're thinking about redirecting some of those resources, at least for now, to content and other digital experiences. Content marketing is also one of those things like customer success and rev ops that has become, I'm not going to say trendy because it's moved past that, but it's a thing, right? Capital T thing. And so much of that is tied directly to revenue, right? You can track a piece of content and what someone does with it and what else they do, pretty clearly through your customer life cycle. And so you can know, this person came to us because they found this webinar or this ebook, and then they did these set of things, and then eventually they bought this thing. And so we can actually, attribute revenue to that. But beyond that, you can use content marketing for people who have never heard of you, people who are in your sales process, people who have been customers for years. So it's a really nice, again, one of those kind of layers that goes across teams, across departments, across functions, and can be useful throughout the revenue organization. And so one of the things that has been a theme in a lot of these conversations is how content marketing does move from kind of an awareness builder to throughout the rest of the buyer funnel or the whole customer life cycle. So how we can enable and equip sales teams better with content so they can use it to add more value to their sales conversations. How we can do a lot more with customer marketing, which hasn't come up a lot, but it feels like it should, which is kind of an interesting question and maybe something I'd like to explore further.
I think we've done a lot of our conversations on the new business acquisition side of the business, and we've started to, we had a great Q&A with Azim Nagri last week, who, we talked about the customer success and account management part of the business. But I think the elephant in the room in a lot of cases for most revenue organizations is the thing that makes you live or die is going to be your customer retention and your, the kind of fun, sexy topic is like going and getting in new customers, right? And so a lot of as you introduce things like content marketing, the big thing about content marketing when it was first being a thing, right? When you start really thinking about like, inbound marketing and that sort of thing was that like, it's going to acquire you new customers, right?
If you write it, you'll attract these new audiences.
Right. But now you really need to be thinking about how does it help you retain?
And that's more than just product documentation and help docs and stuff like that. It is one of the themes that does come out, like what we talked about with Azim and other customer success and account management kind of things, is that the more value we can bring to customers, the more we can help them improve their business, the more likely they are to stick with us and renew and then hopefully expand their business. And so if you think about content marketing as being a way of providing an extra layer of value, getting a customer to think about a process they haven't thought about before, or a way they could incorporate this new idea into their own business, even if it's not about your product. In fact, it probably shouldn't be, it helps them kind of push forward and move into the future. Is one of the things we've heard is that you can't have expansion revenue without something new. And it doesn't have to just be the product. Just having a new product doesn't guarantee expansion revenue. We know cross-sells are really, really hard to do. But a new idea for your customer, a new way for them to grow their business, because as they grow, as they add new things, then you can be here to support that with additional functionality and, bigger accounts and stuff like that. So I think content is a great way of helping build those relationships. And again, because it's so trackable, you can really quantify sort of what's working and how and where it fits, and then use that to build even smarter strategies for the future, so that you know what you need to create, who needs to read it, when, and make sure you're delivering the right content to the right person at the right time. So I think it's really cool to see that content has moved from that, be like, oh, let's have a blog, people will read it, and to this very strategic, connected to revenue across the customer life cycle thing, and just how important it is. I think that's really cool. To see it mature, I think, is what is the theme that we've been hearing a lot.
Right. I think it's interesting, the right customer, the right time. I mean, I think that's so much of what we're talking about is getting the right touch point with the right person and the right timing. And I mean, that's a lot of sales organizations and marketing generally, right? But there is, there's very little opportunity now in this pandemic world for like serendipity, for just kind of like meeting someone at at an event or something like that. I mean, that was one of the reasons that you went to physical in-person events, was so that you could meet people in the halls. I mean, the it's trite, but it's also true, which is that most of the value from these events doesn't happen in the in the main hall where people are talking. It happens in all the conversations and the drinks after and stuff like that. And so you don't get the opportunity to just happen to run into the person who's going to be your next giant customer, right? You have to make that happen, and the way you make that happen is starting to be very, very intentional about how you engage your prospects in every single touch point, whether it's from prospects and customers, whether it's content and how do you reach the right person, whether it's product, whether it's a cold call, whatever it is, right? You've really got to be thinking about that, and that's always been important, but it's now even more important because the other things that used to be able to kind of fuel a little bit of added value there from serendipity is no longer. You got to make your own.
Yeah. So we're engineering serendipity.
Yes, I think so.
In all of this talk about automation, because a lot of these conversations are that, what processes can we automate so we can free up people's time to do the higher value things people are good at? It's sometimes you do think a little bit, you're like, oh, we are engineering so much of this. We're taking out the little magic that people have. But I like to think maybe what we're doing is making room for more magic in different ways. But it is interesting trying to figure out, how do you engineer serendipity? How do you engineer delight? And that's a hard question. But
I wonder, so you mentioned this idea of expanding your customers, and there was really interesting, I think it was a Gartner piece about that, where they were talking about a lot of account management tends to focus very much on service and support, and almost over servicing in order to get the quote unquote privilege of being able to upsell a customer, right? And I certainly have heard that a lot as I've interacted with account managers, like, well, we just solved this problem, then we can talk about this. We'll do that next quarter, that kind of thing. But that called into question something for me, which I think has been like something we've fundamentally held for a while. And our background is in social media, and so there was all kinds of things in the early days of social media where somebody would say something about a brand, and then that brand would go do a cutesy little thing and send them something, and then they would get some more earned media for that. And so that it became this core principle, right, that like you're supposed to delight everyone, right? And so I guess I question that, right? Like, is our goal to delight, or is our goal to do something that is valuable that people recognize, right? I mean, I'm not objecting to delighting people, but I also don't know if is that a real thing that we want to try to do? Should that be a focus? Shouldn't a very good customer experience that gets people what they need as quickly and efficiently as possible really be what we're focused on? It
is interesting, because that Gartner report explicitly found no correlation between, a basic level of service, yes, but beyond that, the above and beyond service does not correlate to more revenue from that customer. Right. And this was specifically about retention and expansion, but I would imagine the same thing holds true for new business as well. Provide a certain level of service, yes, be quick, give them what they need, but you don't have to probably do sales calls on Thanksgiving morning, and that might not be necessary, those kinds of bending over backwards.
And I think that the thing that I think is kind of fascinating about this is that, my deeply held belief about revenue organizations is that they are fundamentally driven by the operational processes that you put in place if you have scale, right? And that doesn't mean that you don't have individual reps who go above and beyond, and it doesn't mean that you don't have people who are working incredibly hard and they're incredibly passionate about what they do and they're incredibly skilled at what they do. What it means, though, is that for you, if you're a revenue leader, to achieve the results that you want, you have to put a system in place that allows you to do that, right? And I think one final theme that I think ties back into this idea of, inside sales, and sort of that being the next normal, is that most of the revenue leaders I talk with are putting a big premium on process these days, and operational excellence, is thinking about how that's ultimately impacting their success. And I think that's always been true to a degree. I mean, most successful sales reps I know, they have their own process, they follow their process, and that's how they achieve consistent results. The ones that don't do that tend to have inconsistent results. They tend to have big months and small months and stuff like that. But you can't have that when you're a revenue leader. And so I think this drive towards inside sales, to more structure, to more process, leads to, I think, a more operational mindset among sales leaderships, which I think feeds into the growth of revenue operations as a concept, because for sales leaders that don't necessarily conceive of themselves as being super operational and maybe are a little bit more focused on the motivational side and the sort of like higher level strategic side, they tend to want to reinforce that operational side because it is so necessary, and so they get strong leaders on the revenue operations piece. But I think that the next normal in this world, you don't survive if you don't have a strong operational mindset on your team. If you're the leader, it doesn't have to be you, but somebody has to have that as a core competency, especially as you scale. And so I think that that's been a theme throughout these kinds of conversations, is that it's all this other stuff that we've been doing, getting our data together, training the team, making sure the reps are motivated, all of it is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's that process layer that you put in place and that organizational structure that you put in place, which ultimately either allows you to grow or potentially inhibits your growth.
Yeah, it's always been true, but the pandemic has made it so clear that where you can do things to drive consistency and predictability in a world that is so unpredictable and inconsistent, that's what we should be focused on. Yep. Yeah, that's absolutely been running through every conversation we've had.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think we should probably wrap up. I guess one last thing I will say before we do wrap up is, we're recording this on, let's see, what is this, October 28th. So next Tuesday, November 3rd, make sure you vote. If you have early voting, you've got, you should go vote now. I think that's it.
Yep. Thanks for joining us.
All right.